Good morning, PSG. It is Sunday, June 21st. Summer solstice took place about 11 hours ago. It is also Father's Day in the U.S., so happy Father's Day. I'm Reverend Bob Paxton. I am the PSG Manager Assistant, also Circles Operations Manager, Board Secretary, and I do the web stuff, all under the rubric of Minister of Information. As we commonly do, we're starting out with today's weather in Madison and also for Barneveld, where Circle Sanctuary is located. High today of 76 and fair skies. It will be a beautiful day. Waynesville, Missouri, where we all intended to be. It's going to be sunny and 86. And then on Mars, courtesy of the NASA InSight probe, today's high of 20 and the low last night of negative 131. Poor camping weather. And then a tweet this morning from the National Weather Service. Why do hurricanes travel so fast? Because if they traveled slowly, we'd have to call them slowicanes. Hashtag dad jokes. Happy Father's Day. An announcement for family programming taking place at 11 a.m. Central. This will not be shown on the PSG Facebook page. You will need to go to Bright Hawk and Hollis's event page that they created for this. If you want to be in on the interactive part of this with Captain Imagination, Bright Hawk, and the Magic Show, you need to read the instructions ahead of time here on the Facebook page to ask to be invited onto the Zoom. Otherwise, you can go to the event page and just watch the show. We will post the link to the event page on our page. Kids are encouraged to wear an imagination cap, any hat will do, and costume, but they don't have to. The key is interactivity. People do need to be on that Zoom to help Bright Hawk and Hollis make this a good show. And that's it for announcements, aside from those that have already been posted out there online. And next, let's take a few moments to stop and hold some space. We're not here in person at PSG this time, but that doesn't mean that there's not value in stopping for a few moments to ground ourselves, to relax our muscles, to listen to what's around us, to think about what we've learned and experienced and said this past week and this past weekend, and think about what we will be taking forward into the week and the year to come. Blessed be PSG. So I'm going to go next into a bit of sacred text, a reading from Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac. This was published in 1949, so apologies for the language that's a little gendered to our current ears. All ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. His instincts prompt him to compete for his place in that community, but his ethics prompt him also to cooperate, perhaps in order that there may be a place to compete for. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. This sounds simple. Do we not already sing our love for and obligation to the land of the free and the home of the brave? Yes, but just what and whom do we love? Certainly not the soil, to which we are sending helter-skelter downriver. Certainly not the waters, which we assume have no function except to turn turbines, float barges, and carry off sewage. Certainly not the plants, of which we exterminate whole communities without batting an eye. Certainly not the animals, of which we have already extirpated many of the largest and most beautiful species. A land ethic, of course, cannot prevent the alteration, management, and use of those resources, but it does affirm their right to continued existence and, at least in spots, their continued existence in a natural state. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. In human history, we have learned, I hope, that the conqueror role is eventually self-defeating. Why? Because it is implicit in such a role that the conqueror knows ex cathedra just what makes the community clock tick, and just what and who is valuable, and what and who is worthless in community life. It always turns out that he knows neither, and this is why his conquests eventually defeat themselves. When the logic of history hungers for bread and we hand out a stone, we are at pains to explain how much the stone resembles bread. One basic weakness in the conservation system, based wholly on economic motives, is that most members of the land community have no economic value. Wildflowers and songbirds are examples. Of the 22,000 higher plants and animals native to Wisconsin, it is doubtful whether more than 5% can be sold, fed, eaten, or otherwise put to economic use. Yet, these creatures are members of the biotic community, and if, as I believe, its stability depends on its integrity, they are entitled to continuance. So, I mentioned at the top of that reading that it's a sacred text to us. Aldo Leopold's cabin and land was about 45 minutes north of Circle Sanctuary's land, and we're grounded in very similar ecosystems. It's a little hillier where we are, and there's a little more clay and silt loam than sand. But there's enough in common that between the lessons that Aldo took from his land and the general biomes and the general rhythms of the land, we really consider him sort of a native saint, right? We call him Saint Aldo. But I bring up this reading because it seems a little bit out of time in a way. The thought that we might have enough spare energy to turn our thoughts beyond our fellow citizens and then extending citizenship to the land with equality between the citizens already managed. Well, equality was far from managed in 1949, far from managed today. But let's stick a pin in that. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But let's talk about spare energy, time, and money. Those of you who've been, around me for some time know that I refer to PSG as a creature of surplus. It's not just the cost to get in, but it's the ability to take a week or more off of work and have reliable transportation to get there, and money for food and camping materials, and the health to contemplate camping outdoors in June for a whole week. These things are not for granted. They are not easy to achieve. And this travel is from every corner of the U.S. Folks are not just traveling to the next county over. If you look at the map of where PSG folks are from, it's largely upper Midwest. But we have strong contingents from California and Texas and Florida, the East Coast, Washington State, Utah. Folks come from all over to come to PSG. It's not an inconsiderable drive to get there. So it's meaningful that we do this. There's something special that happens when you prepare yourself for a journey and you come together through the gate at the appointed time, and you immerse yourself 24 hours a day from the moment you wake up until the moment you go back to your tent in a functioning pagan community for days in a row. We talk about a phenomenon called liftoff. It takes place in, we open the gate on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. local. And usually it's, Tuesday, Wednesday, on rare occasions as far out as Thursday. This thing happens where everything just kind of clicks and rotates a little bit away from outside consensus reality. And it genuinely just takes time to do that. It takes time to shed the weight of the outside news, to be away from all the damnable beeping devices, to have these serendipitous conversations with the people that come there for the same purpose that you did. And eventually you achieve liftoff. Things are different. And in that altered, that different space, that's when the amazing stuff happens. Sparky T. Rabbit, who used to, he passed along, oh gosh, 4 or 5 years ago now. But he once told me something about the importance at pagan festivals of shared suspension of disbelief. And the way he put it was, you can tell me you're queen of the fairies, and I can tell you I can control the weather with my mind. And if you don't call me on my bullshit, I won't call you on yours. So here's the thing. PSG is in that magical vessel that's constructed by all of us after some extended period of time, a place where some of that stuff actually comes true. And I say this as, a pretty science-grounded technology kind of guy. Seriously, you would be astonished at what actually happens, the experiential reality that takes place there. It's a place where we suspend a lot of patterns about the outside world and we envision what could be done better. And then whatever that better thing is, whatever it is, we take it back to the outer world. That's the value of it. We go home. That's the nomenclature we use, welcome home. And we exist in this home space, and then we go on a supply run where we, for the other 51 weeks a year, we take the things that we've learned and we figure out which of them have, which of those tools have applicability out there, and how do we equip ourselves in, not just stuff that we can buy, but in, within our own minds, within our bodies, to prepare ourselves better for whatever it is that we're going to do, that continuation of that work for next year. And that's the real value of it. And we had a interesting object lesson in that a few years ago. Up until about 5 years ago, for a little while there, we offered 3-day passes. The thinking being, what happens if we let folks in just Friday, Saturday, Sunday at a reduced fee? It didn't work. It was an experiment, and we gave that up. And why did it not work? A couple of reasons. First off, it broke the immersion. So you've set aside your worries, your concerns about the outside world, and you've come to know these strangers and take them into your heart as family for some number of days and go through these spiritual experiences. And you're just now in that space of lifting off, and you're having good conversation, deep conversation that goes on day after day after day. And now we've got all of these other folks coming in who have not yet shed the dust of the outside world. They're starting over from scratch. And the place that you're in and the place that they're in is not the same. Can't be the same, at least not for a few days, and we don't have a few days by that point. The other part of it is the volunteerism. The folks that put this thing on are volunteers, right? PSG is a volunteer exercise. And to staff the gate, all of a sudden, we are now taking folks who have been working on the gate, from the beginning, and they've got things settled in, and they themselves have been able to disengage from being on the threshold, and, enough so that they can get fed, right, spiritually. They can take part in this liftoff phenomenon that happens. And now we have to turn them back around and send them back to the gate. Overall, having that 3-day option diminished the experience as a whole. It damaged it for many people. And as I mentioned, all of this that happens at PSG in the real world or here virtually, this all depends on behind the scenes work by groups of volunteers who keep the integrity of the vessel. They provide physical and spiritual care. They build out and maintain shared services, sanitation, transportation, water, all of that. They're all volunteers. I'm a volunteer. The people you've been seeing on screen doing these hours and hours of programming, all volunteers. So, what happened this past week had facets of PSG, used the nomenclature of PSG, and it was a good and worthwhile endeavor for its own reasons. But if this was all that PSG is, the bunch of people that you see engaged in this group would not have the bonds to make this happen. What forged that was the in-person, irreplaceable experience. And that was not replaced this week. COVID-19 took that possibility from us. I mean, it was no question that it would make that choice. I raised that back in February. We've been talking about that. We talked about it for a good amount of time before we finally made the decision. At PSG, people sing a lot. They laugh. They get close and they talk. They get all sweaty and biological with each other. They pass bottles, and they come from every corner of the U.S. and overseas to do it. So, we all know what, the deal is with PSG. This, if it had gone on in person, it would have been my 16th. And it's a really valuable thing to me. Has to be if it kept me coming back, 16 years in a row. So we held out hope for a miracle. I mean, frankly, a miracle is what we're holding out for. A drug, a treatment, effective containment, something that simply did not materialize. So we did a survey, in no small part to broach the topic with all of its facets within the community. And when it came time to decide, we had a Zoom meeting, and the decision was unanimous, uncontested, and took about 10 minutes. It was, with everybody speaking, it was that clear in April that attempting to proceed in person would be irresponsible. And no small part of that was the financial impact to Circle. For those of you who don't know, Circle Sanctuary is the producer of PSG. It provides the bulk of the labor and organization to manifest PSG. It's where all the stuff lives in between PSG. And it provides a good part of the financial support to Circle. It's been a big part of Circle's funding and energetic focus for 40 years. This would have been the 40th year. When this thing got started, I was 9, and my big focus was model railroads, and I think the A team was still on then. It was at that level, and the A team was cool. Let's be honest. But anyway, the thing is though that when we canceled, we offered 3 options: donate the registration to Circle, take a gift certificate for next year, get a full refund. Now, registrations were down pretty considerably. They really dried up at the beginning of March. People kind of knew early on, although they didn't want to say it, but they all kind of knew that, the smart thing to do would be to hang back. But of those that did register, it was about 1/3 who took each option. And Circle got very lucky. The new site did not ask for a deposit. Circle did not have a lot of money tied up in PSG. But overall, by the time it's all said and done, Circle is going to gain for its sustaining year-round work about as much as it did in its worst PSG ever, which was about half of what Circle brought in last year and about a fifth of what Circle had back in 2014. Now, Circle is good at belt tightening. Don't get me wrong. From 2014 to now, we went from 3 full-time employees plus some contract work down to Selena and 1 half-timer. I've never been on Circle's staff. I've always been a volunteer. But that doesn't change the other stuff that needs to happen when you've got a 200-acre nature preserve with buildings to maintain. 3 weeks ago, we put in a septic system. That was $18,000. Not because we really wanted to right then, but because the old one, which was 65 years old, the concrete tank cracked over the winter, and we had to replace it to meet today's standards. And that's something that you have to do. You cannot, operate without a working septic system when you're out in the country. Property taxes don't go down. Insurance is still a thing. You've got to heat the house in the winter, et cetera, et cetera. So you've heard a lot of appeals to consider pitching in to help out Circle in this time. And we, here in our household, we're monthly donors. We've got the ability to do that. And many of you folks listening are monthly donors. And, that's a really key thing. In the last couple of years, it's been that monthly donation appeal, that monthly donation thing that's really kept Circle afloat. And don't forget that, as I mentioned before, about a third of this year's registrations went into gift certificates for future years. So whenever this thing is done, the financial impact of PSG being canceled is going to continue for a little while to come. So to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at a bigger picture thing, you've heard me likely go on about cyclic time versus linear time, how that's one of those kind of core things that happens in paganism, at least, the sort of ISO Wicca derived paganism that talks about the wheel of the year, and wherein, as a practitioner, go through enough Beltanes and you realize that, they're not all the same, but they're not too different. Likewise with every other festival, they all have purposes in common. There are things that can happen in the height of summer that cannot happen in the winter, and vice versa. And watching the patterns of a given piece of land for a while will also introduce you to a slightly different version of that natural cyclic sequence of events. This flower succeeds that one. We're getting on toward time now to watch out for wild parsnip, things like that. Now, typically in June, most of Circle's energy goes into PSG. Had everything gone normally, I'd have been there on the 6th for Welcome Summer, along with the bulk of us. That's the day that we pull out all of the PSG stuff and put it into the 24-foot rental truck to drive it to wherever the site is. Then on Wednesday the 10th, I'd have left for site prep, and a bunch of folks, layout staff, would have shown up the 10th to the 11th, and then getting into the 11th and 12th, setup crew would arrive. And by the time you're done with the day on Friday, that would be about 100 people on site at Circle. Getting into Saturday the 13th, there you've got all of the ministers rolling in. We'll commonly have merchants roll in. And by the time the gate opens at 9 a.m. on the 14th, there's a lot of people who have already separated from their normal order of things and kind of and gone into this new space to start doing that setup. And had everything gone normally, I would be doubtlessly right now at about 10:30, breaking down camp and tossing stuff into the truck and getting the camper lined up and all of that. And then next weekend, I would likely just be decompressing, as would quite a lot of us. The point being that 200 acres of land that I mentioned and those buildings I mentioned, that's a whole month in June where nobody is really working on Circle qua Circle. Then we start going back to that level of work as we can around the heat and storms of July and August and around the wheel spins. And within these cyclical patterns, sometimes the patterns break down a little. So, pardon me, a fire will sweep through a prairie and restore the balance of vegetation. And I use that example for good reason, because Circle is a classic fire ecology, and the balance of vegetation that was there was really established by several thousand years of having perennial fires going through every couple of years and suppressing some plants, letting other plants come up. Sometimes an oak tree is choked out by a grapevine, and the fungi do feast, right? There are plenty of places where you will find, here's this wonderful specimen that now is food for something very different and also wonderful in its own way. And sometimes, a plague will sweep the land, and most things grind to halt for a month or two. Now, the past 3 weeks, with this, breaking of the patterns, I myself have quietly gone out to Circle a few times to do some ongoing upkeep. I've, kept the trails and the greens mown. I've, fixed downspouts and doors and cut brush and all of that. More by far than ever happens in June, more than I ever consider doing that. And I did that for a reason, and I'm telling you this now for a reason. Circle is not going away. When the time comes that we can meet there in person again, all we're going to need to do is sweep up the lady beetles and put up the 10x20s and open the gate. It's that simple. Circle is not going away, regardless of whatever else happens. Its roots are deep, and there are many, many folks that will keep things going the way that they need to help us have events like PSG and all of the other events around the circle of the year, and keep this community thriving in person in ways that we cannot do, here through a camera and a microphone. So, the point I was getting at beyond circles not going away is that by not having all of the energy go into PSG this year, some of it was liberated and other things were accomplished in that gap. When the course of a natural cycle is changed, other things occupy that space. So, turning back for a moment to that Leopold reading and that kind of outlandish thought that we might have enough spare energy to turn our thoughts beyond our fellow citizens to extend citizenship to the land? Well, the reality is we have not extended full citizenship to our fellow citizens. In the beginning of June, a gap was torn in our nation's attention in reaction to the killing of George Floyd. It is not correct nor sufficient to say all lives matter when clearly they do not. Black lives matter. Now, you don't need to shout things that everybody accepts as true. Nobody would be shouting Black Lives Matter if we all agreed that they did. Just like nobody goes around carrying a sign saying the sun will come up in the morning, because we all understand that it will. But now that this social gap has been created, to have this conversation again, because the topic is clear from exhausted and the work is clearly far from being complete, it is a good time within this gap to reflect on how we should do better and fill in those gaps as we can, because, as I mentioned above, we don't all have the same amount of surplus in our lives. And then my final thought. So, remember how I said PSG is a creature of surplus, and that to get to the fullness of it, you really need to put in those full 8 days in a sealed magical vessel until amazing things happen? We do not know how to speed that process along. We've been at it for 40 years. I mean, God's no, we've tried a lot of things. It really does take that time. So, the question that I'd like to pose to you is, what might you call for and advocate for and cause change around that would lead to more surplus in people's lives, such that they could spend some of it in endeavors like this? Not PSG in particular, although certainly including that, but all of those endeavors, including Aldo Leopold's thinking and working toward the restoration of the land, all of those endeavors that only can be given the full and due attention when people have space and time and permission to breathe. Thank you for listening. Wear your masks, and I will see all of you around the fire this time next year.